In the center of Beijing stands a walled complex built for one purpose: to keep almost everyone out. For close to 500 years, ordinary people were forbidden from entering its gates. Emperors were born inside its walls, ruled from inside its walls, and in some cases, never left its walls at all. Today, millions of visitors pass through those same gates every year. Yet, several basic questions about how this place was actually built remain unresolved or are only answered through legend. Historians still disagree about who designed it. Engineers only confirmed how its heaviest stones were moved a little over a decade ago. And beyond Beijing, other emperors built forbidden palaces of their own, including one built by a rival power that would eventually conquer this one. Understanding how these palaces were built means understanding how power worked in China across more than 2,000 years of dynastic rule. Every dynasty that controlled China built palaces on a scale meant to prove that its authority could not be questioned. The size of a beam, the color of a roof tile, the number of steps in a staircase, all of it was regulated by law, and all of it communicated that the ruler's authority came from heaven itself. Examining how these buildings went up is a way of examining how that power was held, inherited, challenged, or seized. Long before Beijing had a forbidden city, Chinese rulers were already constructing palaces meant to impress and intimidate anyone who saw them. In 212 BC, China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, ordered construction of a palace called Epang on the south bank of the Wei River near his capital, Xianyang. Historical records describe more than 700,000 laborers assigned to the project. For centuries, the accepted story was that Epang Palace had been completed, then burned to the ground by a rebel general named Xiang Yu after the Qin dynasty collapsed. Then, in 2004, archaeologists excavating the site announced that the palace had never been completed at all. Only a portion of the massive earthen platform meant to support it had been finished, and there was no physical evidence of a fire. Excavations continuing as recently as 2025 have reconstructed, for the first time, exactly how workers built up that platform, section by section, from opposite ends toward the center. A structure believed for centuries to be among the most extravagant palaces in Chinese history was never finished, and the story of its destruction was false. A more successful and far larger project followed a few centuries later. In 200 BC, the first Han Dynasty emperor ordered the construction of Weiyang Palace in the new Han capital, Chang'an, near present-day Xi'an. Weiyang Palace covered close to 4.8 square kilometers, an area 6 to 7 times the size of the Forbidden City that would be built in Beijing 18 centuries later. It contained more than 40 major halls and was enclosed by a wall almost 14 kilometers around. Weiyang Palace remained in continuous use as an imperial residence and government center for more than 2 centuries, and other dynasties occupied it for centuries after that, before it was eventually destroyed and abandoned. To this day, it is the largest palace complex ever constructed on Earth. Its ruins are mostly compacted earth foundations, but they establish something important. Long before later dynasties built their own palaces, Chinese emperors already had centuries of experience organizing labor, materials, and architecture on an imperial scale. That experience was inherited by the Ming dynasty, which came to power in 1368 after driving Mongol rulers out of China. The Ming dynasty's first emperor established his capital in Nanjing, in the south. His fourth son, Zhu Di, was given control of the northern region around Beijing, then still called Beiping. When the first emperor died in 1398, the throne passed to a grandson rather than to any of his sons. Zhu Di refused to accept this. He fought a civil war against his nephew that lasted 3 years, seized the capital in 1402, and became emperor himself, taking the name Yongle. Having taken power by force from a rival branch of his own family, Yongle needed to secure his position. His own base of support was in the north, not in Nanjing. In 1406, he ordered the construction of a new capital and a new imperial palace in Beijing. Who actually designed that palace remains genuinely uncertain. Popular accounts, repeated by tour guides and travel writers today, credit a carpenter named Kuai Xiang, who came from a family of master builders near Suzhou, and was said to be able to sketch a set of building plans from memory with almost no revision required. Kuai Shengge did work on the project and later became one of the most celebrated architects of the Ming Dynasty. But surviving records also name other figures with major responsibilities. Caixin, credited by some historians as the actual chief designer. Chen Gui, who managed the scheduling of materials. Wu Zhong, who commanded the project overall, and additional supervisors responsible for stonework and brickwork. Ming Dynasty artisans, however skilled, held low social status, and their individual contributions were rarely recorded in detail. As a result, more than 600 years later, historians still cannot say with certainty who was truly responsible for its design. What is well documented is the scale of labor involved. Roughly 1 million workers were assigned to the project, including around 100,000 skilled artisans. Carpenters, stonemasons, bricklayers, and painters. Construction lasted 14 years, from 1406 to 1420, though the bulk of the physical building work was concentrated into its final 4 years, once materials had finally been gathered, prepared, and delivered to the site. Timber was one of the first problems. The palace required enormous, straight, single-piece wooden columns, and the wood chosen for the most important buildings was a species called nanmu, prized for its resistance to rot and insects, and found only in remote forests in the southwestern provinces of Sichuan, Yunnan, and Guizhou. Imperial officials organized logging expeditions into terrain that was mountainous and, in places, barely accessible. Once cut, logs had to be moved more than 1,000 kilometers to Beijing, mostly by river, using fleets that at times numbered in the thousands of barges. Some accounts describe individual operations taking several years from felling to arrival at the site. The Hall of Supreme Harmony, the largest and most important building in the complex, alone used 72 nanmu columns roughly a meter in diameter. Across the whole project, tens of thousands of nanmu logs were used, drawn from forests that would take generations to recover, if they recovered at all. Stone presented a different problem. The largest carved stone in the Forbidden City, a single slab positioned behind the Hall of Preserving Harmony, weighed somewhere over 200 tons, even after later recarving reduced its original size. For years, guides and textbooks repeated a specific story about how it reached the site, quarried at Fangshan about 70 kilometers away, then hauled by 20,000 men over 28 days, sliding along a road of ice created by digging wells at regular intervals and pouring water onto the frozen ground each night. In 2013, engineers from Princeton University and the University of Science and Technology Beijing tested that story using historical records and modern physics. They confirmed the ice road, they confirmed the general route and the 28-day time frame based on a surviving document describing a similar, later stone transport in 1557. But their calculations showed that a team of roughly 100 men, not 20,000, would have been sufficient to move a stone that size across wet ice at the recorded pace. The transport method was real. The number of workers required had been exaggerated for centuries. The floors of the most important halls used a different material entirely. Fired clay bricks known as jinjuan, or golden bricks, made not of gold but of extremely fine, dense clay from a specific district near Suzhou. A single golden brick took more than a year to produce, through 7 separate stages of preparation, shaping, and firing. When polished, the surface became smooth and highly reflective, and striking a finished brick lightly produced a ringing sound rather than a dull thud. Suzhou's imperial kilns remained the only authorized source of these bricks for the entire Ming and Qing dynasties, a span of more than 500 years. By the time all of these materials had arrived in Beijing in 1420, the result was a walled complex covering roughly 72 hectares arranged along a single north-south line running through its center. The Chinese name for the complex, Zijinqing, is usually translated as Forbidden City, but a more literal translation is Purple Forbidden City. The word purple refers to Ziwei, the North Star, which in Chinese astronomy and astrology was considered the fixed point around which the sky appeared to turn, and was described as the residence of the celestial emperor. Because the Emperor of China was titled the Son of Heaven, his residence on earth was deliberately named after the residence of the ruler of heaven above it. The palace's rigid north-south alignment and its layout of enclosures within enclosures were built, in part, to reinforce this idea, that the emperor occupied a fixed central point, just as the North Star did, with the rest of the realm positioned around him. The complex was divided into two main zones. The outer court, closer to the main entrance, contained the largest ceremonial halls, used for enthronements, state ceremonies, and the reception of foreign envoys. The inner court, further north, contained the residences of the emperor, his household, and the concubines and officials permitted to live within the walls. Popular legend holds that the complex contained exactly 9,999.5 rooms, one half room short of the 10,000 rooms said to exist in the celestial emperor's palace in heaven, since an earthly ruler's palace could not equal a heavenly one. A modern architectural survey conducted by the Palace Museum in 2012, which took 5 months to complete, counted 1,100 buildings and 9,371 rooms using traditional Chinese room counting conventions. The real number is different from the legend, but not by much, and it is close enough that guides today still repeat the legend rather than the survey figure. The buildings themselves relied on a structural method with no equivalent in most other architectural traditions of the period. Chinese builders had developed a system of interlocking wooden brackets, called dugong, that carried the weight of heavy tiled roofs down through columns without using a single nail, screw, or drop of glue. Each bracket set was assembled purely through precisely cut joints, stacked and interlocked under the compressive weight of the structure above it. This method predated the Forbidden City by well over 2,000 years. But the palace's builders applied it at an exceptional scale and level of refinement. The flexibility of these joints, combined with columns that were not fixed rigidly into the ground, but rested on stone bases, allowed entire buildings to shift slightly during an earthquake and settle back into position rather than fracture. Records indicate the Forbidden City has experienced more than 200 earthquakes since its construction without structural collapse. In a laboratory test, engineers subjected a scaled model of one of its halls to a simulated earthquake more powerful than any ever recorded, and the structure remained standing. Water posed as much of a design challenge as earthquakes. Beijing's terrain slopes only gently, which normally makes drainage difficult during heavy rain. The Forbidden City's builders compensated with a three-part drainage system, sloped roofs and paved courtyards to direct surface water into channels, more than 1,000 carved stone spouts shaped like dragon heads to funnel water off elevated terraces, and an underground network of stone-lined channels adding up to roughly 15 kilometers, running beneath the complex and emptying into the moat surrounding it. Palace Museum staff report that it can clear standing water from the entire complex within about 20 minutes of a downpour ending, a claim tested and largely confirmed during modern rainstorms severe enough to flood surrounding parts of Beijing while the palace itself stayed dry. Fire was a threat that engineering alone could not fully solve because nearly every structure in the complex was built from wood. The single greatest fire risk came from lightning. The Hall of Supreme Harmony, the largest and most symbolically important building in the entire complex, was struck by lightning and burned down roughly 100 days after its completion in 1420, a failure that occurred almost as soon as construction had finished. It would be rebuilt and burned down again more than once over the following centuries. As a countermeasure, the palace maintained 308 large water-filled vats positioned throughout its courtyards, kept full year-round, and in winter, insulated and heated to prevent the water inside from freezing solid. 18 of the most important vats, positioned near the largest halls, were cast in bronze and coated in gold using a mercury gilding process that consumed several kilograms of gold per vat. When foreign troops occupied Beijing in 1900, following the suppression of the Boxer Uprising, soldiers scraped the gold layer directly off several of these vats, leaving scratch marks still visible on their surfaces today. While the Ming dynasty ruled from behind these walls, a different palace was under construction roughly 700 kilometers to the northeast, in a city then called Mukden. now known as Shenyang. In 1625, a Manchu leader named Nurhaci, who had spent decades unifying rival tribes along China's northeastern frontier, ordered construction of his own palace complex there. Nurhaci's forces had already taken Mukden from Ming control by conquest. Building a forbidden palace of his own was a direct assertion that his authority equaled that of the emperor ruling from Beijing. Nurhaci died before the project was finished. His son and successor, Hong Taiji, completed the main sections by 1636 and used the palace as the seat of a newly declared dynasty, one that would eventually be renamed the Qing. The Mukden Palace followed a design clearly modeled on the Forbidden City, but at roughly 1/12 the size, with about 300 rooms across 20 courtyards rather than several thousand. Its architecture mixed Han Chinese, Manchu, and Mongol elements, including heated brick sleeping platforms called kangs, a detail drawn from Manchu domestic life and absent from the Beijing Palace. In 1644, Qing forces broke through the Great Wall and captured Beijing itself, ending Ming rule. Rather than tear down the palace they had just conquered, Qing emperors moved into the Forbidden City and continued using it much as their predecessors had. Mukden Palace was not abandoned. Qing emperors returned to it periodically for ceremonial visits, and the Qianlong Emperor expanded it further in 1780, adding a library wing to house a set of imperially commissioned encyclopedic texts. Mukden Palace still stands today, the only other complete imperial palace surviving in China besides the one in Beijing, and it was added to the same UNESCO World Heritage listing as an extension in 2004. Qing rule in Beijing reached its most extravagant point not inside the Forbidden City itself, but in a garden palace built beside it. Construction of Yuanming Yuan, usually translated as the Garden of Perfect Brightness and known in English as the Old Summer Palace, began in 1709 under the Kangxi Emperor and expanded dramatically under his grandson, the Qianlong Emperor, across the 18th century. By the time it reached its final form, Yuanming Yuan covered roughly 350 hectares, close to 5 times the area of the Forbidden City, and contained more than 140 separate palace structures set among artificial lakes and gardens. Qianlong, who made repeated tours of southern China and admired its garden design, incorporated regional landscape styles from across the empire into the complex. Starting in 1747, he also added a set of European-style stone buildings and fountains, designed with the direct involvement of the Italian Jesuit court painter Giuseppe Castiglione and the French Jesuit Michel Benoist. European visitors who later saw illustrations of the complex sometimes called it the Versailles of the East. In October 1860, during the Second Opium War, British and French forces reached Beijing. Acting on the order of the British High Commissioner, Lord Elgin, troops looted Yuanming Yuan and then set it on fire in retaliation for the deaths of European prisoners captured earlier in the conflict. The fire burned for 3 days. Structures built of wood were destroyed almost completely. Some of the European-style stone buildings, built from more durable material, survived as partial ruins and remain standing in that condition today. Thousands of objects taken during the looting are now held in museum collections outside China. Yuanming Yuan was never rebuilt. Its ruins were designated a protected historical site in 1988 and remain open to visitors, presented today largely as a record of the event that destroyed the palace rather than of the palace that once stood there. Imperial rule in China ended in 1912 when the last Qing emperor, Puyi, who had taken the throne at not quite 3 years old, was forced to abdicate following a revolution. Under the terms of his abdication agreement, Puyi was permitted to keep his title and continue living in the inner court of the Forbidden City, even though the outer court came under the control of the new Republican government. That arrangement lasted until November 1924, when a coup led by a regional military commander revoked the agreement and forced Puyi to leave. Palace staff later reported that Puyi's household left so abruptly that a half-eaten apple was found sitting on a table in his private quarters. The following year, on October 10, 1925, the Forbidden City opened to the public for the first time in its roughly 500-year history, under a new name, the Palace Museum. In 1987, UNESCO added the complex to its World Heritage List, recognizing it as the largest surviving wooden palace complex anywhere in the world. That designation did not resolve every question about how the palace was built. Restoration work continues on individual buildings inside the complex every year, and each project tends to reveal new information: which timbers were replaced in later centuries, which sections used substitute materials once Nanmu supplies ran low, which decorative details were altered under different emperors. Scientists in recent years have used DNA analysis on wood samples to settle disputes about exactly which tree species were used in different halls, disputes that documentary records alone could not resolve. The identity of the palace's true chief designer remains debated. The precise methods used to move its heaviest stones were unknown until measured and modeled by engineers within the last 15 years. A building constructed to keep out almost the entire population of the empire that built it has, 6 centuries later, become one of the most visited and most photographed structures on Earth. None of the workers who cut the Nanmu logs, hauled the marble, or fired the golden bricks left their names behind. The emperors who commissioned these palaces are recorded in detail, their reigns dated, their portraits preserved, their decisions documented in state archives that still exist. The people who executed those decisions, who spent years or decades of their lives on these projects, mostly did not survive to see them completed, and left no individual record of having been there at all. What remains of their work is the structures themselves, joints cut precisely enough to hold a roof in place for 600 years without a single nail, foundations packed firmly enough to withstand 200 earthquakes, drainage channels still functioning exactly as designed. The palace survives. Almost everyone who built it has been forgotten.